There is a room in the Louvre Museum in Paris that was designed at enormous expense, specifically for one painting. Not a collection, not an era, one painting. The room holds up to 250 visitors at a time, and on any given day, thousands of people stand in that room, pressed together, phones raised above their heads, waiting for a few seconds of proximity to a canvas that measures 30 inches wide and 20 inches tall, smaller than most bathroom mirrors, smaller than the average television screen, smaller, by a significant margin, than almost every other painting in the same building. They wait in that crowd for a glimpse of something they have already seen 1,000 times, on postcards, on coffee mugs, on the covers of books and the fronts of magazines and the backgrounds of films and the feeds of social media platforms that did not exist until 5 centuries after the painting was made. They already know exactly what it looks like, and they come anyway. The question that no art historian, no psychologist, no cultural theorist has ever answered completely is the simplest one in the room. Why? Why this painting? Why not the thousands of other Renaissance masterpieces that hang in the same building, works by the same era, some by the same artist, many of them larger, more technically ambitious, more visually dramatic? Why has a 30-inch canvas of an unnamed woman with no jewelry, no dramatic pose, no obvious narrative, become the single most recognized image in the history of human civilization? The answer is not what you think it is. And the path to that answer runs through a theft, a trial, a war, a series of scientific discoveries that shocked the art world, and a set of secrets that Leonardo da Vinci buried so carefully inside the paint that it took 500 years and technologies he could not have imagined for us to begin finding them. Stay with this, because the further into the story we go, the more the painting changes. And by the end, you will look at it differently than you ever have before. Leonardo da Vinci began painting the Mona Lisa around 1503. He was 51 years old. He had already painted The Last Supper, already produced one of the most influential works in the history of Western art. And yet, according to accounts from people who knew him during this period, he treated this particular commission with an attention that seemed, even by his standards, unusual. The subject was almost certainly Lisa Gherardini, the wife of a Florentine silk merchant named Francesco del Giocondo. The commission was conventional by the standards of the time, a wealthy merchant wanting a portrait of his wife, probably a mark of birth or a new home. There was nothing in the subject matter that would have distinguished this commission from dozens of others Leonardo could have taken, and yet he worked on it for years. He carried it with him when he left Florence for Milan. He carried it when he moved to Rome. He was still working on it, or at least still in possession of it, when he moved to France at the invitation of King Francis I, 3 years before his death in 1519. He never delivered it. The merchant who commissioned it never received it. Leonardo kept it for 16 years, kept it through multiple relocations, through the upheavals of his late career, through everything, and died with it in his possession. Why does a painter keep a commissioned portrait for 16 years without delivering it? The conventional explanation is that he never considered it finished. Leonardo was famously perfectionist, famously prone to abandoning works or stretching them across decades. But art historians who have examined the documentary record note something more specific, that Leonardo's attachment to this particular painting seemed qualitatively different from his relationship with other unfinished works. He didn't simply set it aside. He kept returning to it. He kept it close. Subscribe to this channel right now. Because the reason Leonardo couldn't let this painting go is connected to discoveries made in the 21st century that completely changed the scientific understanding of what he actually put into it. To understand what makes the Mona Lisa technically extraordinary, you have to understand the world it was painted into. Renaissance Italy was undergoing what we now recognize as one of the most explosive periods of artistic innovation in human history, a period when painters were actively competing to solve problems that had never been solved before. How do you represent three-dimensional space on a flat surface? How do you make paint look like fabric, like skin, like the specific way light falls on a human face at a particular time of day? Leonardo was not simply participating in that competition. He was conducting it. He kept notebooks, hundreds of pages of observations, experiments, and drawings, in which he was simultaneously a scientist and engineer, and a painter in a way that no one before or since has managed to integrate so completely. He dissected human bodies to understand the anatomy beneath the skin. He studied the way water moves to understand how to represent motion. He observed how light behaves at different distances to develop what he called the theory of sfumato, a technique for creating transitions between tones so gradual that no individual brushstroke is visible, a technique for making paint dissolve into atmosphere. When the Mona Lisa was examined using infrared reflectography and X-ray fluorescent analysis in the early 21st century, the results stopped researchers mid-breath. The layers of paint in the face, layers that create the extraordinary softness of the transitions from light to shadow that produce the quality of life that viewers have been responding to for 5 centuries without being able to fully explain, were found to be almost unimaginably thin. Some layers were less than 2 micrometers thick. A human hair is approximately 70 micrometers. Leonardo was applying paint in layers thinner than anything that could be detected by the human eye, building up the surface of the face through dozens of applications so fine that under magnification, they disappear into each other. The sfumato technique that researchers documented in the Mona Lisa was not just more refined than anything else from the period. It was more refined than anything produced in the centuries that followed. Painters who came after Leonardo, painters who had access to his work, who studied it, who explicitly tried to replicate what he had done, could not reproduce it, not because they lacked the skill, because no one, including the researchers who mapped it in the 21st century, fully understood how he had physically executed it. The technique remains, in the precise sense of the word, mysterious. Leave a like on this video right now, because what researchers found when they looked even deeper, below the surface of the paint itself, is something that no one expected, and that changes the entire context of the painting. In 2004, a French engineer and imaging specialist named Pascal Cot was given unprecedented access to the Mona Lisa using a technology called layer amplification method, a multispectral scanning process that can penetrate the surface of a painting and illuminate what lies beneath. Cot spent more than a decade analyzing what he found. In 2015, he announced results that sent the art world into one of its most intense debates in living memory. Beneath the surface of the Mona Lisa as we know it, Cot's imaging revealed a different painting, a different face, not a preliminary sketch or an underdrawing that was then painted over. Those are common in Renaissance painting and not remarkable. What he found was a face with different proportions, different positioning, different expression, a face that was, in his assessment, a distinct earlier portrait that Leonardo had painted over. He argued, based on this evidence, that the Mona Lisa we see today is not the painting Leonardo originally created for Francesco del Giocondo, that the final version was painted over an earlier version, possibly of a different subject entirely. The art establishment's response was characteristically divided. Some researchers accepted Cot's methodology and findings as compelling evidence for a radical reinterpretation of the painting's history. Others disputed the interpretation of the data while acknowledging the data itself. The Louvre, which controls access to the painting, declined to endorse the findings officially. What the debate revealed, regardless of which side you find more persuasive, is something crucial: that there is more in the Mona Lisa than can be seen on its surface. That the painting we've been looking at for 500 years is, at minimum, the final layer of something more complex, a palimpsest in which earlier decisions, earlier visions, earlier faces are buried under the one that became the most recognized image in the world. Comment below. Did Leonardo paint over an earlier version because he was unsatisfied, or because he was hiding something? The identity of the woman in the painting has been, for centuries, one of the questions that researchers, historians, and enthusiastic amateurs have dedicated extraordinary energy to resolving. The Lisa Gherardini identification, the silk merchant's wife, is a consensus position, supported by a contemporary reference from a writer named Giorgio Vasari, who mentioned the commission in his biographical account of Leonardo's life. But Vasari wrote that account decades after Leonardo's death, at second or third hand, and historians have noted specific inaccuracies in his account that complicate its use as definitive documentation. Over the centuries, alternative identifications have accumulated. Isabella of Aragon, the Duchess of Milan, Cecilia Gallerani, Leonardo's known subject for another portrait, a Florentine noblewoman named Isabella d'Este. Even, in a theory that gained significant attention when first proposed, a self-portrait of Leonardo himself, the painter's own face feminized, a private joke, or a private meditation embedded in the most public work of his career. The self-portrait theory was taken seriously enough to generate dedicated research. Comparisons were made between the facial structure of the Mona Lisa and the facial structure visible in Leonardo's only confirmed self-portrait, a red chalk drawing made late in his life. Certain proportions were found to correspond with a precision that its proponents described as statistically significant. The theory remains unproven and contested, but it has never been definitively ruled out. What the proliferation of identity theories reveals is something more interesting than any individual theory: that the face in the Mona Lisa resists definitive identification in a way that most Renaissance portraits do not. It is simultaneously specific and universal. It looks like a real person and like an idea of a person. This ambiguity, whether intentional or not, is part of what makes it inexhaustible as an object to study. The smile is where most people start when they try to articulate what makes the Mona Lisa strange. And they are right to start there, because the smile is a technical achievement around which everything else in the painting orbits. It does not look the same when you look directly at it, as it does when you see it in peripheral vision. This is not an illusion or a metaphor. It is a documented perceptual phenomenon. Neuroscientists at Harvard University who studied the painting in the early 2000s identified the mechanism. The smile in the Mona Lisa is rendered in the low spatial frequency range, the range of visual information that the human eye processes most clearly in peripheral vision rather than direct gaze. When you look directly at the mouth, you are using the part of your visual system that processes fine detail, and the smile becomes harder to read. When the face is in the edge of your visual field, you are using the system that processes broader shapes and shadows, and the smile becomes more pronounced. Leonardo, working 5 centuries before neuroscience had a vocabulary for any of this, had painted a smile that exploits the architecture of human vision in a way that creates an experience of perpetual uncertainty. The expression seems to change because the visual information that produces it is genuinely different depending on which part of your visual system is processing it at any given moment. You are not imagining that the smile shifts. The smile shifts. Whether Leonardo consciously understood the optical mechanics of what he was doing is something we cannot know. What we can know is that no other painting from the period, and very few paintings from any subsequent period, achieves this effect. The ambiguity of the expression is not the result of imprecision or accident. It is a result of a technical decision so specific and so sophisticated that it took 500 years of accumulating scientific knowledge to describe it. Share this video with someone who thinks the Mona Lisa is overrated, because what we are about to get to, the theft, and what the theft did to the painting's status, is the chapter that explains why the painting became famous to the world rather than just to the art world. And those are not the same story. On the morning of August 22nd, 1911, a museum guard at the Louvre made a discovery that would change the history of art, celebrity culture, and the relationship between objects and their meanings in ways that no one at the time could have predicted. The Mona Lisa was gone. Not damaged, not vandalized. Gone. Removed from the wall and taken from the museum entirely by a thief who had hidden overnight in a closet and walked out the next morning with the painting under his coat. The theft was not discovered immediately. When the guard noticed the empty wall, the initial assumption was that the painting had been removed for photography, a common enough occurrence that the absence was not alarming. It was only when a photographer denied having it that the investigation began, and it was only after several more hours of searching that the Louvre's administration accepted the unthinkable. Someone had stolen the most famous painting in the museum. The investigation that followed was one of the most extensive and embarrassing in French legal history. The Paris police, the French intelligence services, and eventual investigators from multiple countries were involved. The list of suspects included, briefly, Pablo Picasso, who was questioned and released, and the poet Guillaume Apollinaire, who was actually arrested and held before being cleared. The real thief was a man named Vincenzo Peruggia, an Italian handyman who had worked at the Louvre and believed, sincerely, that the painting belonged in Italy. He had hidden it in the false bottom of a trunk in his Paris apartment for 2 years before attempting to sell it to an art dealer in Florence. But here is what matters for the story of the Mona Lisa's fame. The 2 years during which the painting was missing were the 2 years during which it became universally known. Before the theft, the Mona Lisa was a celebrated work within the art world, known to scholars, to serious collectors, to the educated European public that visited major museums. It was not, by any measure, the most famous painting in the world. The Louvre's most popular attraction in 1911 was not the Mona Lisa. The most reproduced works in popular media were other paintings from other periods. After the theft, everything changed. The story ran in newspapers around the world for months. The empty wall of the Louvre, the hooks where the painting had hung, photographed and published with the pathos of an absence, became one of the defining images of the year. Thousands of people came to the Louvre specifically to look at the wall where the Mona Lisa was not. Postcards of the empty space were produced and sold. The theft did something that 5 centuries of artistic excellence had not done. It made the painting globally legible as an object. Before 1911, most people who knew the Mona Lisa knew it as a painting. After 1911, everyone knew it as a symbol, as the most famous missing thing in the world. When it was recovered in 1913 and returned to the Louvre, the crowds that came to see it were unlike anything the museum had managed before. They were not coming to see a painting. They were coming to see something they had been told by every newspaper and every broadcast and every conversation the preceding 2 years was irreplaceable. They were coming to confirm that the most important object in the world was back where it belonged. The years that followed the recovery were the years in which the Mona Lisa's fame became self-sustaining, the years in which recognition began to generate more recognition, in which the painting's status as the most famous painting in the world became the primary reason for its continued status as the most famous painting in the world. Marcel Duchamp put a mustache on a postcard reproduction of it in 1919 and created one of the most famous works of Dadaist art in history. Andy Warhol silk-screened it into multiples in the 1960s the way he silk-screened Marilyn Monroe, using the same logic, that the repeated reproduction of an image until it loses its original meaning is itself a comment on meaning. Salvador Dali photographed himself impersonating the Mona Lisa. Every artist who wanted to comment on fame, on reproduction, on the machinery of cultural value, reached for the same image, and each time they did, they added another layer of reference that made the painting more famous. In 1963, the French Minister of Cultural Affairs André Malraux sent the painting on a diplomatic tour of the United States, a gesture explicitly understood by both the French and American governments as a political act, a deployment of cultural capital in the service of international relations. The painting traveled in a climate control case accompanied by security arrangements more typically associated with heads of state. In New York, 1 million people waited in line to see it. In Washington, the line stretched outside the National Gallery for days. The Mona Lisa had become, by this point, something that transcends a category of artwork. It had become an object of state, a symbol of civilization, a thing whose value was so widely agreed upon that it had moved beyond aesthetic judgment into the territory of the sacred, the territory where value is assumed rather than argued, where the only appropriate response to the object is reverence. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because we haven't yet reached the part of the story that disturbs researchers the most, the evidence, gathered over decades of psychological and neurological study, that the Mona Lisa may be engineered at a level of sophistication that we are still not equipped to fully measure. The research into why the Mona Lisa produces the responses it produces in viewers has generated, over the past 30 years, a body of scientific literature that is genuinely surprising in what it reveals. Eye-tracking studies, experiments in which the precise movements of a viewer's gaze across the painting are mapped in real time, have shown that the Mona Lisa directs viewer attention in ways that differ from virtually every other painting studied. The composition creates a loop. The eye is drawn to the face, moves to the landscape behind the left shoulder, moves to the landscape behind the right shoulder, returns to the hands, returns to the face. This loop repeats. Viewers who report feeling absorbed by the painting, a common response, are, in the eye-tracking data, literally caught in a visual circuit that the composition creates and sustains. The landscape behind the figure, which appears at first glance to be a single continuous environment, is actually 2 landscapes that don't match. The horizon line on the left side of the painting is significantly higher than the horizon line on the right side. This means that the landscape behind the Mona Lisa is physically impossible. The 2 sides cannot coexist in a real space. Researchers have proposed various explanations for this, that it was a deliberate choice, that it represents different times of day or different moments, that it was an error Leonardo never corrected. What everyone agrees on is the effect. The figure seems to float slightly free of her environment. She is simultaneously anchored in a landscape and independent of it, present and removed at the same time. The light source in the painting presents a similar anomaly. The light illuminating the face appears to come from the upper left. The light illuminating the landscape appears to come from a different direction. Again, a single painting, two light sources. The effect is that the figure and the landscape seem to exist in slightly different realities, which contributes to the uncanny quality that viewers describe. The sense that the woman is watching from somewhere just beyond the physical space of the canvas. What emerges from all of this research is the portrait of a painter who was not working intuitively. Leonardo was, according to the evidence of the painting itself, making decisions that could only have been made by someone who had studied the mechanisms of human visual perception with the same rigor he brought to anatomy and fluid dynamics. He understood, at some level, how the eye moves across a surface and built the composition to exploit that movement. He understood the perceptual difference between direct and peripheral vision and used it to create an expression that lives between certainty and ambiguity. He understood the psychological effect of contradiction, the mismatched horizons, the impossible light, and used it to make a figure that seemed simultaneously real and dreamlike. There are people who have stood in front of the Mona Lisa and felt nothing. This is worth acknowledging, because it is a more common experience than the mythology around the painting tends to admit. Art critics have written about the Mona Lisa's current presentation, enclosed behind bulletproof glass, on the far wall of a room designed to manage crowds rather than enhance encounters with art, surrounded by the noise and jostling of tourism, as almost perfectly designed to prevent the experience the painting is capable of producing. The art historian Noah Charney has described the modern encounter with the Mona Lisa as a confrontation not with a painting, but with its own fame. You are not looking at Leonardo's work. You are looking at the most reproduced image in human history from a distance of 15 feet through protective glass in a room that smells of 250 people. The painting has been so thoroughly consumed by its own cultural status that accessing it as a painting requires an act of imaginative reconstruction that most people standing in that room are not prepared to perform. Researchers who have been granted private access to the painting, who have stood in front of the lone and controlled light, close enough to see the brushwork, consistently describe a different experience. They describe the quality of the surface as unlike anything else in the museum. They describe the eyes as appearing to track movement in the room. They describe the expression as genuinely shifting rather than simply ambiguous. They describe, more than anything else, an intensity of presence that they find difficult to explain in terms that don't sound like mysticism. The painting is not overrated. In the judgment of those who have seen it under the right conditions, it is underexperienced. The fame has created a presentation context that actively prevents the encounter that would justify the fame. Leonardo da Vinci died on May 2nd, 1519, in the Château du Clos-Luz in France. He was 67 years old. According to the account of the painter Giorgio Vasari, the same writer whose report is the basis for the Lisa Gherardini identification, Leonardo died in the arms of King Francis I of France, who had given him a home and a pension and a title in his final years, and who reportedly wept at his bedside. The Mona Lisa passed, after Leonardo's death, to his assistant John Giacomo Caprati, known as Salai, a young man who had been Leonardo's student model and companion for nearly 30 years. When Salai died 4 years later, the painting was sold to Francis I and entered the French royal collection. It remained in the possession of the French state through the Revolution and eventually came to rest in the Louvre, where it has been, with the exception of the years Perugia had it under his bed and the years it was evacuated for safekeeping during the Second World War, ever since. The painting spent at least 4 years in Versailles. It spent time in Napoleon's bedroom. It was removed from Paris twice in 2 centuries to protect it from invasion. It has been attacked. A viewer threw a rock at it in 1956, and a woman threw a teacup at it in 2022. And the vandals in both cases caused no lasting damage because the glass that protects it now is the same thickness used to protect nuclear material. A painting of a woman sitting in front of a landscape, protected like a weapon, guarded like a head of state, visited like a shrine. Leave a comment below. Do you think we have made the Mona Lisa too famous to see it clearly? Or do you think the fame is a response to something real, something in the paint itself that we haven't finished understanding? The question of what the Mona Lisa means, as distinct from what it depicts and how it was made, is a question that keeps generating new answers because it is a question that was never fully answered to begin with. For Vasari, writing in the 16th century, it was primarily a technical achievement. The proof that Leonardo had mastered the representation of nature in a way no painter before him had managed. For the Romantics of the 19th century, it was something darker, the embodiment of mysterious feminine power, eternal and unsettling. Walter Pater, the Victorian critic whose description of the Mona Lisa as older than the rocks among which she sits shaped a generation's understanding of the painting, was not describing a portrait of a Florentine merchant's wife. He was describing an archetype, a symbol of something that he felt the painting contained but couldn't name. For the 20th century, the Mona Lisa became primarily a symbol of cultural value itself. The thing you reference when you want to invoke the concept of supreme artistic achievement, not because of the specific quality it possesses, but because everyone agrees that it possesses the quality of being supreme. This is circular, and the artists who point out the circularity, Duchamp, Warhol, the long line of artists who have defaced or reproduced or subverted the image, were making a legitimate point. The fame had become the content, and yet the neuroscience data doesn't support the conclusion that the fame is entirely self-generated. The eye-tracking loops, the perceptual ambiguity of the smile, the impossible landscape, the extraordinary technical refinement of the surface, these are real properties of the object, not projections of its celebrity. The painting does something to viewers that other paintings don't do, even under the compromised conditions of its current presentation. The question of whether that something is sufficient to explain 500 years of sustained fascination, or whether the fascination has long since exceeded what the object alone could generate, may be genuinely unanswerable. In 2020, researchers at the National Institute for Nuclear Physics in Italy announced the results of an analysis that had taken years to conduct and that added one more layer to the already dense literature on the Mona Lisa's physical composition. Using a technique called X-ray fluorescent analysis, they identified the specific chemical composition of the ground layer, the preparatory surface on which Leonardo painted, and found that it was different from the ground layers used in other paintings of the period, including Leonardo's own earlier works. The compound they found, lead white mixed with manganese and zinc oxides in specific proportions, was not, as far as the researchers could determine, a standard preparation recipe used by any other painter of the time. It was, to the degree that historical documentation allows, specific to this painting, which means that Leonardo prepared the surface of the Mona Lisa differently from the way he prepared any other surface, a choice that would have been deliberate, that would have been made in the knowledge of how the ground layer affects the behavior of every subsequent layer of paint. Why? What did the specific preparation of that ground contribute to the final result? The researchers proposed hypotheses. The particular chemical composition may have contributed to the stability of the extremely thin layers applied above it. It may have contributed to the specific way the surface is aged. The Mona Lisa has cracked over 5 centuries in patterns that are different from the cracking in comparable works, and the ground layer may be part of the explanation. It may have been an experiment, a deliberate deviation from established practice and service, an effect Leonardo was trying to achieve. What it confirms is what the rest of the scientific evidence confirms, that the Mona Lisa was not painted the way Leonardo painted other things. He did something different here. He prepared differently, applied the paint differently, managed the light sources differently, built the composition differently. Whether this was because the subject was different, because his ambitions were different, or because he was trying to achieve something specific that required solutions he had not used before, the documentation does not say. The documentation says only that he worked on it for 16 years and would not let it go, 520 years after Leonardo began it. The Mona Lisa hangs in a purpose-built room in the Louvre and is visited by approximately 10 million people per year. It is insured for a value that the museum declines to specify. Previous estimates have ranged from $800 million to over $1 billion, though its representatives note the figure is largely meaningless for an object that will never be sold. It has its own Twitter following. It has been photoshopped into hundreds of thousands of memes. It is the first thing most people name when asked to name a famous painting, and the image most commonly used in advertising when a brand wants to associate itself with a concept of supreme cultural value. And somewhere inside the bulletproof glass and the climate control case and the crowds and the phones and the postcards and the decades of accumulated symbolism, there is still a painting. A 30-inch canvas with a surface built from layers of paint thinner than a human hair, with a smile that changes when you're not looking directly at it, with a landscape that cannot exist in physical space, with a face whose identity 5 centuries of scholarship has not definitively established, and with something in the combination of all those things that made the man who created it carry it across 3 countries for 16 years and die without ever letting out his hands. Whatever that something is, whether it is fully captured in the neuroscience or the chemistry or the art history, or whether it exceeds all of them, it is real. It has been producing a response in human beings for 5 centuries across every culture and every era and every level of art education. It produced that response before the theft made it globally famous in the people who saw it in the French Royal Collection and in the Louvre before 1911. And it continues to produce it in the researchers who are given private access and stand in front of it alone and find themselves, consistently and somewhat unwillingly, unable to fully account for what they are experiencing. This is the mystery that no amount of scientific analysis has resolved. Not because the science is inadequate. The science has revealed extraordinary things. But because the thing the science keeps finding, the deeper it looks, is more complexity, more deliberateness, more evidence of a mind that was doing something in this painting that it was not doing anywhere else, with a level of intentionality and technical sophistication that keeps retreating just ahead of the instruments we build to measure it. Leonardo da Vinci wrote in his notebooks that the greatest mystery available to a painter was a human face, that the face was a place where the soul expressed itself most directly and most impenetrably, that to paint a face truly was to paint something that could never be fully seen. He spent decades studying faces. He dissected the muscles beneath them. He mapped the way emotion moves through them. He developed a technique for rendering them that no one has been able to completely reproduce. And then he spent 16 years on one face, one particular face, in one particular moment of one particular expression, in front of a landscape that cannot exist, with a smile that looks different every time you look at it. The face he painted is the most recognized face in the history of human image-making. It is on more walls, in more countries, in more formats than any other human face that has ever been rendered in any medium. It has outlasted the civilization that produced it, the religion that surrounded it, the political structures that owned it, and the artists who created it by approximately 500 years. And we still don't know what she's smiling at. If this investigation changed the way you think about the most famous painting in the world, if the story of the theft, the science, the impossible landscape, and the 16 years Leonardo refused to let go left you with questions you didn't have before, subscribe to this channel and leave a comment below. Tell me, do you think the Mona Lisa deserves its fame? Or has the fame consumed the painting? Share this video with someone who stood in that crowd at the Louvre and felt nothing, because the painting they were looking at, the real one, the one Leonardo built layer by microscopic layer over 16 years, is not the one they saw. It is still there, behind the glass and the crowds and mythology. It is still watching. And it is still, 5 centuries later, doing something to the people who look at it that no one has completely explained. The most famous painting in the world is famous for a reason that the fame itself has made almost impossible to see. The challenge, the real one, the one that Leonardo left for anyone willing to do the work, is to look past the image you already know, past the postcards and the memes and the bulletproof glass, and find the painting underneath. It is there, and it will change the way you look at everything else.